He could play piano by ear at 4 years old. His teacher at the Royal Academy of Music once played him a 4-page Handel prelude, and he played the entire thing back perfectly, like a gramophone. Those are his teacher's words, not his. He wrote one of the greatest songwriting partnerships in history with a man he never sat beside to compose. They worked in separate rooms, sometimes separate cities, for over 50 years. Critics said he dressed too strangely to be taken seriously. He sold over 300 million records anyway. Fame nearly destroyed him. Cocaine nearly killed him. He later admitted he used it every 4 minutes at his worst. He spent the final 2 weeks of his addiction alone in a room in London, not coming out, not eating, not sleeping, just using. Then a teenage boy dying of AIDS changed everything. He got sober. He built one of the world's most important charitable foundations. He raised over $600 million, fighting a disease that was killing his friends. He found love. He became a father. And then, at 76 years old, he walked away from touring with the highest-grossing farewell tour in history, $939 million, 330 shows, 6 million people saying goodbye. By the end of this video, you'll understand something most people miss about Elton John. The costumes weren't the disguise, they were the armor, and underneath them was a man who kept surviving chapters that should have been the end. This isn't just the story of Elton John. It's the story of Reginald Kenneth Dwight, and how he refused to disappear. Long before the sequins and the platform boots, there was a quiet boy sitting at his grandmother's piano in Pinner, a suburb on the outskirts of London. He was 4 years old. Nobody had taught him to play. He just listened to music once and repeated it. His mother heard him picking out Waldteufel's The Skater's Waltz and knew something was different about her son. His name was Reginald Kenneth Dwight, born March 25, 1947. An only child in a house that felt like a war zone. His father, Stanley Dwight, was a Royal Air Force squadron leader, strict, cold, emotionally absent even when he was physically present. Stanley banned pop and rock records from the house. He wanted his son to become a banker. He never once came to hear him play. Not as a child, not as a teenager, not when he became one of the most famous musicians on the planet. Never. His mother, Sheila, was warmer, more liberal. She smuggled rock and roll records into the house when Stanley wasn't home. Little Richard, Elvis Presley. The sounds that would reshape her son's entire life entered through the back door of a house where they weren't welcome. Young Reg found 2 things at that piano: a talent that felt supernatural, and an escape from parents who argued constantly. Music became the room where the fighting couldn't reach him. At 7, he started formal lessons. By 11, he'd won a junior scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music in London. He attended Saturday classes for 5 years, studying Chopin and Bach. He could memorize long, intricate pieces after a single listen. His instructors were astonished. But here's the contradiction that would define his entire life. He was extraordinary at the piano, and he was miserable everywhere else. Overweight, unpopular, plagued by an inferiority complex that started at home and followed him everywhere. The boy who could play anything couldn't feel like he was enough for anyone. His parents eventually divorced. Stanley remarried and had 2 more sons. Years later, Elton would visit his father and discover that Stanley was warm and affectionate with his new children. The same man who'd been cold and dismissive with Reg was a different father to different sons. That wound never fully healed. And the costumes, the glasses, the outrageous performances that would make Elton John famous, he'd later say those were his way of letting go after a childhood where nothing was allowed. The boy who wasn't permitted to play in the garden would one day own stages the size of football fields. But first, he needed to find the one person who could complete what he couldn't do alone. In 1967, a 20-year-old named Reg Dwight answered an advertisement in the New Musical Express. Liberty Records was looking for songwriters. Reg showed up at the office of A&R man Ray Williams, hoping to prove himself. He played, he sang, he was turned down. But before he left, he mentioned something that would change music history. He told Williams he couldn't write lyrics. Williams reached into a pile of envelopes on his desk. These were submissions from other aspiring writers who'd answered the same ad. He grabbed one and handed it to Reg, a sealed envelope. Reg opened it on the London Underground ride home. Inside were poems written by a 17-year-old farmer's son from Lincolnshire named Bernie Taupin. The poems were beautiful, lyrical, full of imagery that felt cinematic. Taupin had grown up in the English countryside, raised by a mother who studied French literature and a grandfather who taught him to love nature and narrative poetry. He could write words that painted pictures, but he couldn't compose a single note of music. One couldn't write lyrics. The other couldn't write melodies. Neither of them passed the Liberty Records audition, and together, they became one of the most successful songwriting partnerships in the history of popular music. They started by mailing work back and forth. Taupin lived in northern England. Dwight lived in London. Lyrics arrived in the post. Melodies went back the other way. Eventually, Taupin moved south, and the two lived together at Reg's mother's flat in North London. But here's the detail that still amazes people. They never wrote together in the same room. Not then. Not now. Not across more than 30 albums spanning over 50 years. Bernie writes the lyrics first. He slides them under a door, leaves them on a table, or hands over a sheet of paper. Elton sits down at the piano with the words in front of him and composes music on the spot, sometimes in minutes. They'd written roughly 20 songs before they ever met in person. Taupin later called it a non-sexual love affair. The partnership was so unusual, so unlikely, that people struggled to believe it was real. They wrote songs for other artists first. Easy listening tunes they could sell. Then in 1969 they began writing for themselves. And Reg Dwight made a decision. He needed a new name. He borrowed it from two members of his band Bluesology, saxophonist Elton Dean and singer Long John Baldry. In January 1972, he made it legal. Reginald Kenneth Dwight became Elton Hercules John. His debut album, Empty Sky, came and went in 1969. His second, the self-titled Elton John, was released in the spring of 1970. It contained a song called Your Song. In the United Kingdom, it was a modest success. In America, it barely registered. His label was running out of patience. Dick James, his British manager, put a final $10,000 behind a plan to launch Elton in the United States. The venue was the Troubadour, a 300-seat club on Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood. The date was August 25, 1970. What happened that night is still talked about as one of the most important concerts in rock history. The room was packed with music industry figures: Quincy Jones, Brian Wilson, Mike Love, Gordon Lightfoot, Linda Ronstadt. Neil Diamond took the stage first, not to perform, but to introduce a man he'd never met. He told the audience he was there because he'd heard the album. Then he sat down. Elton walked out wearing Mickey Mouse ears. His drummer, Nigel Olsson, saw him backstage putting them on and felt a mix of horror and laughter. It was the beginning of the costumes, the beginning of the character, and the beginning of everything. He opened with Your Song. By the time he reached Take Me to the Pilot, the room was levitating. Linda Ronstadt's words, not a metaphor. The next morning, Robert Hilburn, of the Los Angeles Times, wrote a review that read like a prophecy. Rock music, he said, had a new star. He's Elton John. Tuesday night at the Troubadour was just the beginning. John Lennon heard the album and called it the first new thing to happen since the Beatles. Think about that. The boy whose father wouldn't come to a single performance had just played a club in Hollywood, and the biggest names in American music were calling him a genius. Britain had hesitated. America believed. And within 2 years, Elton John would become the most commercially dominant rock artist on the planet. Between 1972 and 1975, he released 7 consecutive #1 albums in the United States. 7 in a row. Honky Chateau, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Caribou, Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy, Rock of the Westies. Nobody had done that before. Nobody's done it quite like that since. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, released in October 1973, was the peak. A double album, 17 songs. Bernie Taupin reportedly wrote all the lyrics in 2.5 weeks. Elton composed the music in 3 days. The album was recorded in 12 days at a chateau in the French countryside. It produced 4 singles that became permanent fixtures in pop culture. Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, Benny and the Jets, the title track, and Candle in the Wind, a song written about Marilyn Monroe that would take on a completely different meaning 24 years later. The album hit #1 on the Billboard 200 and stayed there for 8 consecutive weeks. It was the best-selling album in America in 1974. It sold over 31 million copies worldwide. But here's what nobody talks about when they discuss that period. The bigger Elton became on stage, the smaller he felt off it. The costumes got more elaborate. The glasses got more outrageous. The performances got more explosive. And underneath all of it, Reginald Dwight was disappearing. He once said the costumes were his armor. The louder and flashier he became in public, the more he was hiding in private. He was dealing with his sexuality in an era when being gay could end a career. He was dealing with the emotional wreckage of a childhood that left him believing he wasn't worthy of love. And he was dealing with it the way too many people deal with pain they can't face. He started using cocaine in the mid-70s. At first, it made him feel confident, invincible. It filled the silence that terrified him. Then it took over. By the 1980s, his addiction was catastrophic. He later admitted to using cocaine every 4 minutes at his worst. He suffered chest pains, spasms. He'd be found on the floor and carried back to bed, only to start again 30 minutes later. He spent entire days awake, sometimes 3 at a time. Alongside the cocaine and alcohol, he battled bulimia for nearly 2 decades. He used food the same way he used drugs, to fill a void, then purge the shame. The eating disorder started in the 70s and didn't stop until the 90s. Millions of people saw Elton John on stage and saw confidence, glamour, a man living his best life. What they didn't see was someone who later said there were moments when he thought he wouldn't survive. The world loved Elton John. Reginald Dwight was falling apart. And then he met a boy named Ryan White. Ryan was a teenager from Indiana, a hemophiliac who'd contracted HIV through a contaminated blood transfusion in 1984. He was 13 years old. When his neighbors found out, they ostracized his family. His school tried to ban him. The stigma of AIDS in the 1980s was vicious and absolute. Elton first became aware of Ryan in 1985. He visited the family, helped them move when the hostility became unbearable. He became close with Ryan and his mother, Jean, not as a celebrity doing charity, as a friend. On April 8, 1990, Ryan White died. Elton was at his bedside. He served as a pallbearer at the funeral. He performed Skyline Pigeon in front of 1,500 mourners. Ryan's death broke something open inside him. He later said it forced him to see how completely his own life had come apart. He was a gay man who'd spent the entire AIDS epidemic in a drug-fueled haze. He'd done nothing to help, nothing to fight. He'd been sitting on the sidelines while people were dying. Within 6 months of Ryan's death, Elton checked himself into Parkside Lutheran Hospital in Chicago. He chose that facility specifically because it was one of the few that could treat his bulimia alongside his addictions to cocaine and alcohol. He wrote a letter to what he called his worst, best friend, cocaine, and promised he'd never touch it again. Treatment was brutal. Detox was rough, but the emotional work was harder. He had to learn who he was without drugs, without alcohol, without the armor. He walked out sober on July 29, 1990. He hasn't used since. Over 35 years clean. People expected another tragedy, another rock star flameout. Instead, they witnessed one of the greatest comebacks in music history. But what makes Elton's recovery different from most celebrity sobriety stories is what he did with it. In 1992, he founded the Elton John AIDS Foundation. It became one of the largest non-governmental funders of HIV prevention and treatment programs in the world. To date, the foundation has raised over $600 million and supported programs in more than 55 countries. He didn't just write a check and move on. He made it his mission. He showed up. He advocated. He used his platform to fight the stigma that had destroyed Ryan White's childhood and was still killing people around the world. And he stopped asking what music could give him. He started asking what he could give back. Then came September 1997, and 2 losses that shook him to his core. That summer, Elton lost his close friend, fashion designer Gianni Versace, who was murdered outside his Miami home. Princess Diana comforted Elton at Versace's funeral. Weeks later, Diana herself was killed in a car crash in Paris. Elton was devastated. He called Bernie Taupin and asked him to rewrite the lyrics of Candle in the Wind. Taupin agreed. On September 6, 1997, Elton performed Candle in the Wind 1997 at Diana's funeral in Westminster Abbey. He played it exactly once in public. That single performance. The song became the fastest-selling single in history, 33 million copies worldwide, the best-selling chart single of all time. Every penny of the proceeds, over £55 million, went to Diana's charities. A song originally written about Marilyn Monroe became a nation's farewell to its princess, and the man who sang it had been sober for 7 years. The same man who'd nearly died alone in a room in London was now standing in Westminster Abbey, holding a country together through music. That's reinvention. Not the costumes, not the glasses, this. In the years that followed, Elton built the life he never thought he'd have. He'd married a woman named Renate Blauel in 1984, a relationship he later acknowledged was an attempt to deny who he really was. They divorced in 1988. In 1993, he met Canadian filmmaker David Furnish. They entered a civil partnership in 2005, the same day the Civil Partnership Act came into effect in England. They married in 2014, when same-sex marriage became legal. Together, they had 2 sons, Zachary, born in 2010, Elijah, born in 2010, the man who'd grown up believing he was unlovable, whose father never attended a single concert, became a devoted, present, hands-on parent. He built the family his childhood had denied him, and then he made one more decision that stunned the music world. In January 2018, Elton announced the Farewell Yellow Brick Road Tour. He was done with touring, not because his voice was failing, not because ticket sales were declining, because he wanted to be home with his sons. He said it plainly. He'd spent his life on the road. He didn't want to miss his children growing up. For a man who'd been abandoned by his own father, that decision carried a weight that went far beyond concert scheduling. The tour began in September 2018 at the PPL Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Tickets for the first 60 shows sold out within hours. Over the next 5 years, Elton played 330 shows across 5 continents. 6.1 million people bought tickets. The tour grossed $939 million, the highest-grossing concert tour in history at the time. He was the first artist to cross both the $800 million and $900 million marks. The final show took place on July 8, 2023, at the Tele2 Arena in Stockholm. He walked off stage knowing he'd never do a large-scale tour again. Most legends fade away. Elton wrote his own ending. But his legacy didn't stop at the concert hall doors. In 1994, he composed the soundtrack for Disney's The Lion King with lyricist Tim Rice. Can You Feel the Love Tonight won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. He later composed scores for the musicals Aida, Billy Elliot, and the stage adaptation of The Devil Wears Prada. In 2024, he completed the EGOT, winning an Emmy to go alongside his Grammys, Oscars, and Tony. Only the 19th person in history to hold all 4. He was knighted in 1998. He became a Companion of Honor in 2020. He's sold over 300 million records. He's had 7 consecutive #1 albums. He's placed at least one song on the Billboard Hot 100 for 31 consecutive years. He's the most successful solo artist in the history of the American charts. And none of that is why his music still matters. A shy boy sat behind a piano in Pinner, wondering if anyone would ever hear him play. The world heard far more than piano. It heard a survivor. A songwriter who found the perfect partner through a sealed envelope on the underground. An addict who chose recovery because a dying teenager showed him what courage actually looked like. An activist who turned his pain into purpose. A father who broke the cycle that his own father couldn't. Elton John wasn't defined by the costumes, or the glasses, or the 300 million records. He was defined by something much harder. Every time life tried to end his story, he wrote another chapter. His father never came to a single show. Elton filled stadiums anyway, not to prove Stanley wrong, but to prove to every kid sitting alone at a piano that the music inside them is worth more than anyone else's silence. Perhaps that's why his songs still connect across generations. Not because they're perfect, but because they were written by someone who proved that even the brightest stars can lose their way completely and still find their way home. He asked for a toy train station as a child. His father gave him a guitar instead. The world got Elton John, and he's still not finished.